Welcome to another video of this guy editing a selfie that he took in the woods so strangers on the web can learn from his Lightroom editing workflow. Today I'm gonna try and focus on why it's important to do certain things in a certain order whenever you're editing a photo, and along the way I'm gonna try and give out as many tips as possible while also promoting the Lightroom presets that I sell on my website. And one more thing before we jump into Lightroom, I wanna say thank you to the post-processing subreddit for all the love that they showed me on the previous video. Now let's go to Lightroom. Here we got a selfie that I took using a GoPro camera. You can see the settings on the screen right now. It's nothing special, I just tried to keep the ISO as low as possible and expose in such a way that I don't blow out the clouds in the sky, even though most probably I'm going to do that while editing it. And because this is shot on a GoPro, there is a lot of lens distortion. And I'm going to enable the profile correction, but also tone it down a bit. I want the trees to look somewhat straight, but I don't want the edges of the photo to be completely stretched out because that doesn't look really good. So probably around 50% is good enough in this case. I also would prefer to have the trees somewhat vertical in the photo, and while it would have been perfect if I did this while shooting, it's not always possible, so we're gonna compensate with a bit of a transform and get the trees to look somewhat parallel. And I'm also going to crop the image a bit because there's no really useful or pleasant information up here. And also by doing this, I'll reduce the amount of white edges, maybe even banish them completely, but I'm not sure yet. And I'll go with a 4:3 aspect ratio. I think this is a classic approach, and I want this photo to be somewhat symmetrical. You can see the trees line up perfectly with these vertical lines and might actually get us a nice composition. And the quick tip here, if you want to get different guidelines, is to press O on your keyboard and Lightroom will show you different guidelines. In this case, I want the subject to be right in the middle of the photo, so I'm going to use this one to align it perfectly. And let's go back to this one. I like to have this one selected so I can reference different horizon lines. Step number 2 is jumping to X. I want to see how much details I'm able to pull out of this raw file. And for this, I'm going to tone down the highlights a bit, increase the shadows, increase the exposure overall because I purposely shot this underexposed. I'm also going to increase the blacks a bit, tone down the contrast even more, and we can see that the GoPro files are pretty good at retaining a ton of details, maybe even a bit too many details. So let's blow out the sky and do a bit of exposure correction in order to get a pleasant gradient throughout the entire image. I want the upper part of the photo to be really light and the bottom part to be in a somewhat simulated shadow. To do that, I'm going to start with a big radial gradient on the top part of the image, where I'm going to decrease the dehaze. This is going to give me a lot of bloominess. I'm also going to decrease the clarity and the texture, and this is giving me an overall look that looks like haze. And I'm also going to add a bit of this is just the beginning, and I know it looks bad right now, but bear with me. Next up, a linear gradient from the bottom part of the image going up. That's going to decrease the exposure just a bit, but because I do have these very dark spots already, instead of using the exposure tool, I'm going to use the curves, where I can see a graphical representation of what I'm editing, secure the upper parts with a point. Now I can pull down on these points in order to generally decrease the exposure in that area. Let's see before and after. It's pretty subtle, but it's much better than using just the exposure. And I'm also moving around the gradient so I can get the effect that I'm looking after. Now I have a general idea of what I want in the image, and I can tune it up a bit more. I'm gonna add one more radial gradient because I want some vignetting, but that one is going to use the exterior of the radial, something a little bit like this, just toning down the exposure on the edges of the frame. One more radial gradient to get some light on the subject. All this is to set the general exposure of the photo so I can play around with the sliders and see if I need more or less info from the raw file. It's rather important to do it now before I start playing around with the curves panel. Let's say for example that I'm using the picker and pick from the sky right here. You can see the point is pretty high on the histogram because the sky is rather white, But if I drop the exposure significantly and pick again from the same spot, the point on the curve line is in a completely different spot. So if I want my curve line to be accurate to what's in the photo, I need to have my basic adjustments dialed in before I start playing around with the curves panel. And there's one more thing that I should have mentioned in the beginning of the video. My goal for the image. I want a warm feeling image without having the tones pushed too much into the yellow zone. I want it to feel vintagey but still fresh and saturated. And I want the overall atmosphere in the image to be one of relaxation. So with that in mind, let's check the white balance, and we can see that there is a bit pushing towards the blue. The day was overcast, so that usually means around 6000 Kelvin. I'm not gonna push it more because I don't want all my tones to go into yellow, so I can still use the HSL. I know daylight is 5500, so I'm gonna split the difference and go for 5700. Over here it's still a bit blue, but I'm going to deal with that in a different way. I'm going to HSL and I'm going to drop the saturation in the blue channel completely and also reduce the green and the aqua or cyan channel. This is going to leave me with only warm and green tones in the image, and where it was blue before, it's gonna turn in neutral gray. I can get away with this because I'm going to use color grading to basically inject color in those areas that are now gray. And to start my film emulation process, I'm going to go for Kodak-inspired color response curve. I'm going with the D60 variant even though I want warm tones, because I plan to get the warm tones in the color grading step and with some local adjustment mask. But I'm also going to reduce the contrast just a bit, since Kodak-2383 is quite a contrasty film. I'm also going to inject some green into the shadows, but not too much. And I'm saying this because over here I was starting to notice magenta tones. Now, I'll increase the shadows some more. I'm constantly keeping an eye, so this area over here doesn't get too dark. And to counteract that, I'm gonna raise the shadows just a bit more. But sticking to the film emulation idea, I'm also going to apply grain. I'm thinking either 800 or 400. I'm going to pick 800. And even though we have a lot of tiny details, I'm going to reduce clarity and texture just a bit to make sure there are no details in the image that are smaller than the grain. Now it's time to finally play around with the luminance curve and get a nice filmic tone. I'm going to raise my black point a bit and create a filmic tone over here. And for the highlights, I pretty much want to blow out the entire upper part of the image. So it looks like there was way more fog than it actually was on the day. And to double down on that, I'm gonna go back to masking and pretty much repeat what I did in the first one, but by stacking multiple masks that basically do the same thing, you're going to get a more natural looking image overall compared to using just one that will provide a very clear edge of what you did in post-processing. Again, I'm reducing clarity, texture, and even sharpness because I want to get the impression that there was fog above me. And I'm also going to do a bit of a trick since I'm blowing out this image, and the luminance mask that apply grain is based on actual exposure in the photo. With this mask, I'm also going to add just a tiny bit more grain to make sure there is some grain in this upper part of the image. Overall, the edit is starting to come together. I'm gonna subtract with a brush this tree just a bit out of the mask, not even that much, but I want it to be somewhat similar with this one over here. Here I'm going to add a bit more warmth to the foreground. Since I'm going with a film emulation look, I'm careful not to get zones with really strong contrast, and I'm looking more of a gradual slope in every part of the luminance curve or any local adjustment that I do. Now let's finally check out the color grade. I do want a bit more warmth in the shadows, but to counteract that and not have the entire image just lean into warm tones, I'm going to counteract it with green in the midtones and even a bit of cyan in the highlights, but afterwards I'm going to balance it towards the shadow. Blending goes up, and I'm also going to increase the luminance in the highlight and be really subtle with the amount of sand that I'm pushing into the highlights. Also, the green that I'm injecting in the midtones is going to lean a bit into the yellows. This way it's a more natural green. And also I want to target the trees over here and adjust their hue just a tiny bit to make them stand out. I think I prefer it even more without any cyan in the highlights. I'm going to creatively use luminance. This usually reduces noise in the image, but I'm using it to create a bit more haze over the entire image and make it look bloomier. Being shot on a GoPro, I really couldn't use a black mist filter or anything like that, so I'm trying to compensate in post. Another thing that will make the subject pop out is increasing the luminance in the orange channel. This way my hoodie stands out a lot more. And there's one thing that I think I didn't do justice, and that's the saturation in my hammock. Because I completely removed the saturation in the aqua channel, it got pulled into gray, and because of that it looks like it just pasted there. So I'm going to increase the saturation in the cyan channel back a bit. And also I think if I decrease the luminance value just a tad, it's gonna look a lot better. And there's one more thing that I want to do before taking this photo to Photoshop to fill in this ugly gap up the bottom. I'm going to go to my film camera profiles. These are all curves that were baked into camera profiles, and I'm going to replace the GoPro Hero 9 camera profile with a film emulation. This is going to help me get an even more filmic look, and I'm going to go slowly through some of them so you can see the stuff that you can buy on my website. I really like the Kodak Pro image. It offers a lot of warm tones. Kodak Portra 400 is the usual suspect for warm tones, but since it's not released, why would I even go with it? And another film that I really like is the Kodak 200, and especially the pushed version. I think it provides really nice brown tones and a really warm overall image quality. So I'm going to go with it. It's available on my website, don't forget that. And now I'm gonna go to Photoshop, remove a few distractions like this plastic bag or rock, whatever this is, fill in the gap, and this was pretty much the edit for this photo. But I'm not going to bore you with that process. The important thing that I want to stress in today's edit is that you have to go through the basic adjustments before starting to color grade, and more importantly, before doing your curves adjustment. That way you get a balanced starting point and you can actually place points on your luminance curve based on stuff that's in your image and create contrast. That's it. That's how I took this photo and transform it in this edited version. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, maybe share it with a photographer friend, and I'll see you in the next one.